there were a number of contacts that I had down here, but mainly it was the fact that they knew that Vittorio had been very interested in me, and then when I knew about what the school was, my two musician sons were just getting out of high school, and so we sent them both down here. And Mark, our cellist, was in the first senior class of the high school. That's the way the school started. And so as soon as we read this about Vittorio, we called him, and it was terrible for the school. They'd just barely gotten started. And so I remember that summer before, we'd gone down to pick up our two boys and bring them home for the summer, because we were in New York at that time. And I saw Vittorio, and I knew that he had had this heart attack, and he was white as a sheet. And I said, Vittorio, you've got to get away from here this summer. Well, he did, but it was to do his score and all that. So it didn't really surprise me. He had had this, and I remember he used to come to the lunchroom in Juilliard, and he'd have a paper bag, and it was a head of lettuce, and that was his lunch. And he was a good Italian spaghetti eater, and he would look at this lettuce with the greatest scorn. And so in that sense, it didn't surprise me, because he had really worked very hard getting everything started. The thing that really started it was the Ford Foundation big grant to New York City Opera. And because they didn't find it easy to find those 2 seasons of operas at American Operas, and it was a big pressure on that company, but they lived up to it. They were wonderful. And so many of the singers there at that time were the Americans who were just coming up. And so we had these wonderful casts. Emerson Buckley, who I always felt was one of the finest opera conductors I've ever known, and but a good staff all the way around. And the way it worked with me, on that series, they had done He Who Gets Slapped, our first opera, and Julius used to come back at the evening when the rehearsals were going on, and he'd always stop and listen. And I thought, well, it was nice of him. When, after the first opera, he asked us whether we were working on another one now. And we said, no, we haven't. And he said, well, when you've got a project, come along. I want to commission it. So that was nice, too, to, have that immediate result afterward. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Because I was I had only had the one opera, and that was quite earlier, not very early before this. And so it was happening just at the time when there was this, we were back, a lot of us around New York, and wanting to get productions, and knew that it was not going to be the Met. Sam was the only one that would get the Met. And Menotti did too, but not even he got it as much as. And then that was such a wonderful feeling at the New York City Opera at that time, to not only see these operas, but meet these people, see what was going on. And many of them, that you'd never heard of before or just heard of. The first, let me see, which of, the first one that got this award.
Oh, Carlisle.
Yeah, Carlisle. I forget it was his second opera that was on that series, but they had already done the other one. So but it was just a terrific moment for all of us. Well, some of us, of course, didn't live in New York. I lived up in Nyack, New York at that time. And, I don't know, where we did see each other is most of us went to every show. And that was great. Yep. And now all this stuff is going on. And I'm amazed that the man that seems to have bought it and gotten his name on it, because he's rich as Croesus, and but it's not a man whose politics I admire. I started out as a boy soprano at very young age. I did everything that I could do in school, and I was brought up in the Presbyterian Church. So I was in the choir, and I'd sing solos and so forth. And then, I took a little piano during that time. But when I got into high school and junior high, Cleveland had wonderful school music. And so that while I was in junior high, I sang in operettas and was singing in everything that they did at that school. And then in high school, they had a wonderful regular choir, but they also had a madrigal choir. And boy, that was an experience. And a fine conductor. And I did 2 Gilbert and Sullivan operas there. And that was all. So by that time, there was no question. But I graduated from high school in 1929. And it was later than that. It was that's when I went into high school. But anyhow, I was sure that's what I wanted to do. But when I graduated from high school, the Depression was on. And my father's business had a bad time there. But our home was always, I had 2 sisters and 2 brothers, older than I was. And the 2 sisters played piano. My mother had played the organ a bit. And she always told the story. It was in a church that had one that the person back there had to pump, and her younger brother would pump. And he'd pump it till you couldn't get the keys down, and then he'd walk away. And so anyhow, and one of the older brothers had done some singing and played the violin a little, and the other one he made his whole career out of the Cleveland Playhouse, which from that he went to New York, so forth. So I had all that around in the home, and I used to remember when I was very young, my sisters, my family liked to have their kids having their parties at home, not where they didn't know where they were. So every Saturday night practically we had a big party in our house, and it always wound up with my sisters at the piano, and they'd all sing, the hit tunes from the musicals, the Twice 55 songbooks and the hymnal and all those things. And they had a wonderful time doing that. And I can still sing from any of those old songs, because I'd come down the stairs as far as I could without being seen, and I'd listen to all of this. So it was a very good, healthy music background I had there. And then this high school, John Adams, that I went to, had 2 years of harmony. And that's where I started to compose. Yeah. And then when I graduated, I couldn't go away to school right away, but I did audition at Oberlin, but in voice, and my voice was changing because I was a year early getting out of high school. So anyhow, that was the year that the pianist of the Cleveland Orchestra, who was also a composer, I had gone to him to study piano, and I paid for my lessons because I'd become a good copyist. And so I used to copy his songs and so forth, which was what he wrote. And but he was very good and a good teacher. And so then my high school teacher, what was the name of the man from NYU who was his teacher and was in town? My teacher said, I think it might be good for you to play some of your things for him. And I was writing mainly songs then. So I did, and I thought, boy, now I'll be able to go to NYU. And I began to talk to him about that, and he said, no, NYU isn't the place to go for you, Eastman. And there was no question for a composer, Eastman was the best place at that time to go, because Hanson really built that whole program, and he really knew it from his heart. And so I did go to Eastman and did 4 years there, one of the best 4 years of my life. Well, there isn't that much opera, and the big one that he wrote and hoping to have a great success was for the Metropolitan, and it was, what do you call it, Marymount. And he had Tibbet in the cast, a big cast, and by that time he was being played around a lot. But I've never heard the whole opera because I've never been where I could hear it. But I heard certain music in it, which I knew, and but he could write great tunes, but this story didn't have the best drama that it could have. But I remember particularly the big love tune in it. When I'd go to the women's dormitory to pick up a date, why, I'd sit at the piano and play his tune. Oh, and all the girls, because they all knew it, he was playing it everywhere. So that was great fun. But he was, and even as a teacher, I also studied with Bernard Rogers there. Hanson he played the cello, but he also improvised on the piano very easily. And when you brought in your stuff to him, if you were having a problem, he'd sort of improvise you out of it. And I didn't learn as much from him as I did when I went to Juilliard and studied with Frederick Jacobi, who got me right down to analyzing the great scores and so forth. And I learned, but the great advantage at Eastman was that from the second year you could have an orchestra piece played every year. And the first one I wrote as a junior, or as a sophomore, was good enough. It was a setting of 2 songs of Edna St. Vincent Millay. And we had a very good dramatic soprano at the school at that time. And she sang it, and it was chosen, and it got played on an NBC program. And so that was one of the wonderful things. And the students were all, music was their life, and they were a wonderful bunch, a good faculty. So that was tremendous. But then I went to not Tanglewood at that time. I went to the McDowell Colony one year. And I met all these wonderful writers and painters and so forth. And I thought, boy, I got to go to New York. And So Juilliard had no tuition at that time, and you could live for $78 a month in New York. So two of the other graduates and I both went. One was a clarinetist and the other a pianist, and we found an apartment on West 123rd that we rented, and so we could cook there and so forth. So that was my first year in New York. Well, I had the curiosity because for the drama, when my brother was at the Cleveland Playhouse, at the end of the run of every play, he could get a couple of comps, and a best friend and I saw every play that they did at this. So I was very interested in drama. But at Eastman, they had two English teachers, and they were both very lively people. One particularly, he knew all the literature of the contemporary literature. And well, the other thing, I worked in the library all the way through while I was at Eastman. And he used to come in the library and a lot, and I was in his class. And so he sort of guided my reading to all of the most important books. It was a tremendous value. And but there were others at Eastman that were that way too, and where you were encouraged to read. And so that was where I got that. And then when I went to the McDowell Colony, that expanded it even further. And because Juilliard at that time, the academics were pathetic until Bernard Stambler came to head it. And that was when we met. And he had had an amazing background. When he was in high school, he had a teacher of his was involved in the claque at the Metropolitan. So while he was in high school, every Saturday he would go to the Metropolitan as part of the claque. He knew more opera than I knew, and so that became a very stimulating, because we did 4 operas together. Well, when I was at Juilliard, I had met Aaron through first time I met him, it was well known if you were a young composer and you went to New York, you'd call Aaron and he'd invite you to come. And so I did that while I was at Eastman the first 2 years, or while I was at Eastman. And I remember the second one because we had a very good talk, and I showed him some of the things I'd done. And then I said, Aaron, what are you writing now? Because I had gotten to know him through the League of Composers. I became head of the church, the concert selection of what we played. And so he said, oh, I've just finished my piano sonata. And I said, gee, I'd love to hear it, but I won't be around New York to hear it. And he said, would you like to hear it? And I said, well, yes. So he sat down and he played it. And I'll tell you, he played it like no one else I've ever heard play it, because the slow movement just is heaven somehow. And so that was wonderful. So when then I came to Juilliard, I again got to know him, and he and Fred Jacoby, who were involved with the League of Composers, got me on there because I had a big wind ensemble class at Juilliard, and I could get them wonderful young performers who were loved to have the chance to play in those concerts. So that's when I got to know him. And then I went to to Tanglewood, and that was great because Leonard Bernstein was there. There were 4 or 5 of the best young conductors in the country there, and a bunch of composers. And Hindemith was teaching as well as Aaron, and it was interesting the difference in the way those 2 men taught. But Aaron was, I think I had the single most valuable lesson that I ever had, because one day I was playing a piece that I was working on, and he said, when he stopped a minute, and Aaron never wasted words. He thought, and then he said exactly what he had to say. And he said, "Bob, do you write at the piano?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'm not so sure that's so good for you. You're not a good pianist. You know, if I was Lenny Bernstein or one of those, that would be another thing." And but he said, "You've got a good ear. You've got a sense of the orchestra, which I'd developed at Eastman before." And he said, "I think you ought to get away from the piano." Well, the only way you could do that at Tanglewood, in the boys' school, which was out up in the town up there, I forget the name. Anyhow, it was out where it had a big porch that looked out on the mountains. And that was the only place you could get away from music that close to it, because students were practicing all over the place. So I started, and I've done it ever since, because, you know, the great secret of that is that you can sketch 3 or 4 minutes of music, but you only get to work on the vocal or the main line, but you're hearing all of the rest of it. And if your ear is good, then you can go back, but you get the line for them. And that really was of great importance to me the rest of my life. I had at one point been a conscientious objector, but at that time we were meeting all the refugees from Germany, and the stories that we heard. I said, "This has to be stopped, and I'm no different than anyone else." So I was even ready to go right into the Army, but I had done some work for a major musical work. He wanted I did, I guess, a piano reduction of the Vaughan Williams, the wonderful piece for strings. And anyhow, so I thought, I'm going to ask him about this. So I did, and he said, "Look," he said, "don't go in now. They'll call you. They don't even have weapons enough for the people to have a weapon to train on." And so I just waited, and I was drafted, and I was sent to Fort Riley, Kansas for my basic training, where I was learning to ride a motorcycle. There was a truck, a motorcycle, or a horse. Well, I figured the horses weren't going to figure much in this war, and I didn't want to drive a truck. Yeah. So I got in. About the 4th week I was there, I got this note in my there that the commandant wanted to meet with a group of us, and I wondered, what the hell did I do? He wants to meet with me. Well, then I found that I had met 4 young writers, 3 other composers and 3 writers there that I knew, and I found that every one of those had got a note. So we appeared for our meeting, and so the commandant said, "Well, young fellows," he said, "you're probably wondering why you're here." We said, "Yeah, what did we do?" He laughed, and he said, "Well, I'll tell you, it was right after this was the Army had its huge success in New York. And he said, do you suppose you fellows could write an all-soldier musical for Fort Riley? Well, the silliest question we ever heard. So we all were put on special duty. I was a bartender in the officers' club in Dry, Kansas. And so we were put on special duty, and we just sat down. We wrote this musical, which was naturally called The Life of Riley. And then we toured around the Midwest with it for about 6 months. And that was really a holiday. And so then when that was quieting down, I wasn't sure what to do next. I was no longer in a unit of any kind. But I had heard about the Army Music School, which was formed to train players to become conductors. And so I thought, gee, I shouldn't have trouble there because I'd been teaching conducting. So I applied and got in and was there for just a month, really, because they were turning us out fast. And but that was interesting. The old warrant officers who taught, for instance, were just guys who had played an instrument and had been a conductor. But they couldn't play the keyboard. We had about 70 of us there. And so they'd give us dictation, but they were afraid we'd cheat if we could see their hand. So they'd play the tune for us to take, and they'd get it all mixed up. And you couldn't tell whether it was 3/4 or 6/8. And so we were given a tune. And all of us just looked around at each other because we had Thor Johnson in the class, conductor at Columbia University at that time, bunch of people that had, good experience before. And so they split the class into two, and if you did it the wrong meter, you went into what we call the dubs class. So I wound up in the dubs class, and I walked into the first, because they separated us in a different class, and I walked into the first class, and here was this young guy playing the score at the piano, and it was the Symphony of Psalms. Well, he obviously could play. It turned out he had been an organist at one of the big churches in New York. It was William Strickland. And so he got in the piece, and I knew the Stravinsky very well. And after I said, look, there are a couple notes, you played the wrong ones there. He looked at me. We left the school that night on the bus and got talking. And he was one of the greatest friends I ever had. I was very sad when he died early because he got commissions for me, publications. He had been involved with one of the publishers in New York. And so that was a big boost at that time. And so that was the Army Music School. Well, then I was, after the first month, I was sent to the 7th Division, where they had 3 regimental bands, and when I first went, I had one of them. And then later I became the division. And I had a 56-piece band, wonderful players. I had a swing band that, I tell you, we played all the big Glenn Miller arrangements. We played and I had a Guy Lombardo band because that's what they like to dance to, and I had a Goodman sextet. And here I could write for these people, and I conducted them. So it was my whole experience in jazz, because at that time, Eastman and Juilliard, neither of them did anything with jazz. Oh, yeah. So, and I wrote half of the songs for this show that we did. And I remember the first one, I had written orchestra pieces, but I had never scored for a swing band. So I scored this, and our guitar player was a guitarist with one of the big bands, and he did arranging too. He looked at my first arrangement, and he laughed, because I had written it all in 6/8 time, because that's what jazz really plays in, except if they say, divide here, 2. And so I didn't know that, but I learned the whole thing out there. So with these fine players to work with. And but actually our division was, we did the islands, taking the islands, the first beachheads there. And we started our first one was Attu. Then we came to Hawaiian Islands for 6 months about, where I met my wife and we were married. And but then we went off and did four more islands, including we were the first troops into the Philippines. But the last one we took was Okinawa, and we were on Okinawa in training to be the first troops to go into Hiroshima when the atomic bomb fell. Well, of course, that ended it, and so instead of going in there, we went up to South Korea as the occupation force there, and saw the Japan Army out of there. And so my Army career, I never fired my gun once, except in training. But because we were the division command posts guard all the time. And the worst thing that we ever had was one night when all the hell broke loose outside the camp, and all the lights on our barbed wire went off and everything. A horse had wandered into it. Yeah, she was a Red Cross recreation worker, and that was sort of funny too, because in the Hawaiian Islands at that time, or particularly in Honolulu, there were about 100 senior officers for every 10 girls. And so we were scheduled, we would go around playing concerts at the various hospitals and so forth. So we went to this one, which was actually going out, scheduled to go to west to a field hospital. And Mary was setting up the chairs on the stage. And not only was she one of the first girls that we saw in 6 months, man, but she was a damn nice-looking gal. So I got online to get a date. But it happened that when I got out there, I met the conductor of the Honolulu Symphony, who was a nice guy, and we got talking, and I told him that, yes, just the year before at Juilliard, I had conducted the first performance of my second symphony. It was my graduation piece, more or less. And so he talked, and he says, "You've got to come and play that with my orchestra." So this was all arranged, and I went. And one of the happiest things was when I took my bow, I looked out, and there was Mary sitting with a lieutenant colonel. But this raised my stock a lot. I had just one semester to finish, and so I finished that. But they also asked me to teach a class then, and I taught a couple at Columbia. And then when I graduated from Juilliard, I went on the faculty. So I was there 10 years. I finally was Bill Schumann's assistant. And meantime, I was, for 3 years, I was heading the 3rd Street Music School downtown. I succeeded Julius Riddell, who had been down there. And I was also conducting the Doctors Orchestra of New York. So I was a very busy fellow. Yes, I had met him before because some songs of mine, which he heard and liked, were done on one of the concerts in New York that was given. So and he was wonderful because not only was he a fine composer, and this was, you see, around the time he did Baby Doe, and so he was very great. From that point on, as a matter of fact, I didn't teach there anymore, but I went on the Ditson committee. And I just got off that a year ago or so ago. I was chairman of that. Jack and I went on the committee at the same time. He was at Eastman after I was, so I only met him in New York. But we were very good friends. As a matter of fact, the last meeting that I didn't handle it for the Ditson, Jack took, and he died 2 years later. Very sad. When I was at Eastman, the last year, I began to think about opera, and I even knew there was a wonderful play that all took place under the Brooklyn Bridge. It was his top play. He wrote a lot of Broadway plays. This one was in poetry, but it was a beautiful play. And I remember I thought that would make a great first opera. And there were about 3 or 4, including Lenny. He also was very interested in it. But the poet would never let it be set into an opera. So I thought about it then. Well, then when I got to New York, did you know Norman Lloyd, the dean at Juilliard, but then he went out to Oberlin and was dean out there, and then he was the head of the music section of the Rockefeller Foundation. So anyhow, while he was at Juilliard, he had heard songs of mine. He was a composer, didn't do too much, but anyhow. And he said, "Have you ever thought of writing an opera?" And I said, "Yeah, I certainly have, but I don't have a librettist." And he said, just that time his phone rang, and he had to leave the office for a moment. He said, "Look, stay here for a moment because you might find a librettist in my next appointment." It was Bernard Stamler, who had gone on the faculty there. So that started it. Yes. Well, then the first property, we had read a lot of things and we had thought about certain things. But I had, thanks to my friend who got me reading so many good things, had read He Who Gets Slapped, which is the Russian writer. And so I had a copy of it, and I went home that evening And I read the first 2 acts, and I was so impressed, I thought, boy, this is it. I called Bernie, and I said, Bernie, have you got a copy of this? He said, yes. I said, read it. I think that's it. Then I came back and I read the last 2 acts. It's a strange play, because what happens in the 3rd act brings in all new characters but one, and then it doesn't seem to connect into the last act. Well, so I called Bernie back and I said, Bernie, I'm not sure. Because the last act, the one person, the rich baron, and he who gets slapped, both fall in love for the bareback tango queen. And so they actually kill each other, wanting to get to heaven to get Sunita, the girl. Well, Bernie and I didn't have that kind of belief about heaven and all those things. And we thought that the 3rd act just didn't go with it. So it wasn't in copyright. Nothing in Russia was at that time. So we say, we'll do it. If we can't do it in Russia, well, all right, but we can do it here. So we wrote the opera, and it was first done. Columbia was doing with the Ditson Fund. So it was the last one they did there, actually. And but Bernie completely rewrote the last 2 acts. Took all those killings and suicides at the end out, and wrote a brilliant 3rd act and 4th act, which pulled the whole thing together, got the girl with the bareback tango king, who was what you really loved. But so that was the script. Well, I tell you this because at the first performance, which took place at the Juilliard Auditorium, Norman Lloyd came up with this young man, and he said, look, I'd like you to meet Mr. Andreev. And we said, well, Andreev is dead. And it turned out to be Andreev's son, who worked at the United Nations. And so we had a nice talk with him, and he had been to the opera with Norman. And I asked him, what do you think your father would have thought about it? He said, well, he wouldn't like it. And we talked a little bit, and we told him about the reaction of the last act. And he said, well, I know, but that was very special. A sort of protege of his father had run off with his wife. And this was all about that. So that was... So then the Ford Foundation thing came, and Julius I had first met when I walked into the office to take over his...
at the 3rd Street Music School.
Yeah, and so then that was the start of it.
And then...
Well, that... oh, God. What happened on that, when the He Who Gets Slapped was done, one day at a rehearsal, one of the singers in that sat with us, and he said to Bernie, he said to me, what are you planning for your next opera? And we said, oh, I don't know. We're reading a lot of things and have some ideas, but some things we can't get the rights, and others we're not so sure about. And he said, well, I'll tell you what will make the greatest American opera of all. And it's playing 2nd time in New York right now. And it was in that 2nd performance, and he mentioned the Crucible. So he said, go see it. We did. I was never so moved in a play in my life as I was. And I came out, I was going to get that. and because already other people were after it. And so I knew if I had to go through all of the agents, that could be murder. So my brother, who was in the theater in New York, called him and I said, look, do you have any connection with Arthur Miller? I'd like to get to him straight on. And he said, well, let me think about it. Well, that night when we saw it, the New Yorker came out on Wednesday to subscribers in New York. And when we came in, I saw this woman with the New Yorker from that day, and I knew that there was the review of He Who Gets Slapped and the Bolshoi Ballet, which had opened that week at the Old Met. And so the next morning I got, because it was on the stands in the morning, I got a copy. I called my brother, and he had said, let me think about it. And I said, by the way, you'll be interested in the review in the New Yorker, because it was just one that, a composer dreams about, because there was a big, very favorable review of the Bolshoi, which it fully deserved. And then the next paragraph began, but of much greater significance. And then it wound up with very good review, the performance and all the rest. And then the last sentence was, these are two people to watch. And that really, and then of course, when the Pulitzer, the Crucible got the Pulitzer, that was the biggest send-off I could get. But as a result, my brother knew Arthur Miller's, one of his good friends was Arthur's producer. So the next day he picked up a copy of the review and he went in to see Arthur, or his friend, and he put this review on the desk and he said, well, my brother's interested in that. And he knew a little about me, I guess, at that point. So that's how it all came about. Well, not only the implications of the opera, but it was when he had married Marilyn Monroe, so that was that. I could tell you a few stories about that, but I won't go into it. But anyhow, because we never met her. What happened was that my brother called me that night, and he said, get 3 tickets for the Millers and his friend for the next performance, the last performance of He Who Gets Slapped. So Arthur turned up with the other. Marilyn didn't make it as usual. But anyhow, so I met him there, and afterward we went out and had a drink at the hotel. It's right near the old opera house. And it turned out that when he looked into the witchcraft thing, he thought it might make a better opera than a play. And he even was thinking of the first scene and some music. And he was a good friend of Mark Blitzstein. So he called Mark, and Mark told us this conversation later. Arthur called, he said, hey, Mark, he said, how long did it take you to learn to write the music for an opera? Mark thought a minute, and he said, well, he said, I don't know, but it'll probably take you about as long as it took you to write your first good play. And Arthur says, ugh, thanks, Mark, and hung up, forgot to play opera. But he had been really looking for it, and so he saw He Who Gets Slapped, which was in a way a good thing because it had unusual characters and some politics in it. And so, as a matter of fact, my life has been blessed with more of these things that just happened at the right moment. Well, the other operas, for instance, from a standpoint of craft, they're all as good as that is. But this story had so much publicity and everything else about it. The whole government committee that wanted to put him in jail for a while, and also in New York, there were a lot of people who were very familiar with that whole story and were liberal or left politically. So that never hurt it. And and it's a damn good opera or play, marvelous play. And it's just had this wonderful send-off when it got the Pulitzer Prize. Now everywhere I go, it's Pulitzer Prize winner. You know, every job I ever took, I made it a condition of my going on taking the job that I was a composer and I needed time to compose, and I would want a schedule that would condense my time within. It'd be a full schedule, but I'd take it in a short period so I had the other part of the week to write. Well, to join the Juilliard faculty at that time, because Bill Schumann felt the same way. And so he put all of the composers that were there on a schedule where we had our main classes Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and the weekends we had an assistant, and they would take a drill class or something. So, and when I went to the publishing firm, it turned out that the man who owned it was a law professor at Columbia, and he had played the flute, and he would organize chorale groups because he loved vocal music. His father was Kernick, his name. I don't know whether you ever heard of it, but he had started the company, and so Jack had studied a little composition, and the first time he ever heard any of my music was my first recording, my first symphony, which was recorded in Vienna, and he heard this, and after we came to know each other, he said, you know, he said, I had thought one time that maybe I would go back and take some more lessons in composition. And after I heard your symphony, I decided you were the guy I wanted to go to. And it turned out he inherited the firm, and the other person who had been the head resigned. And suddenly I was offered this job to head. It isn't a big publishing company, but it was a good one. It had a good catalog and so forth. And he had become the head of the company, but the donor didn't want any of the music business. All he wanted was the building and the real estate. So he put it on the market. And Jack, our friend, became the director there. And so when this happened, he called us and said, look, would you be interested in buying this firm? And Jack Kernick had money. And so Jack got interested. So we had gone over to meet the people in Stainer and Bell, the other firm, Elkin. And so when we got this call that this was on the market, Jack said, Bob, go look at it, see what you think. So I went over to London for a couple weeks, met everybody and looked it over. But Stainer and Bell had its catalog from 1850 with lots of copies left. And it had a printing plant with these old flatbread presses, which they'd got new ones too, but they still were using some of those. So finally I looked it all over and I thought, my God, we'll never be able to do this both. But he got very fascinated with it. And so I called him long distance the last night I was there. And I advised, I didn't think it was good. We had great plans for Galaxy. And I knew that we'd never get to those. And we talked, and he said, I think we should buy it. Go ahead. And so he did. And so for a while I was going back and forth to London. And that was fascinating. I made some very good friends over there. And did you ever hear the name Thurston Dart? Well, he was on the board of Stainer and Bell. And John, he was the head of the British Arts Council for music. John Dennison. And I met them. They were wonderful people to get to know. And so I enjoyed it over there when I was having to go over and work with them. And but I had never been a publisher before. I knew what publishing was all about, but I got into this, and I had complete support from Jack. He also, he wanted me to keep writing, would suggest pieces if I was interested and so forth. So then the 10th year I was there, I got another Guggenheim Fellowship. And I had been working very hard, and things were going slow. I said, Jack, I want to take this. Well, by that time I had got a good staff. So we went up to Maine, and I was up there when I heard about the death. And I think that meant a great deal to them, because they knew the school is half a state school, but it also has to raise its own money. And so they knew that I had all the qualifications from having been, on the staff at Juilliard and publishing house, the business, and was at that time getting quite a few performances around, so they had heard that time. So it was kind of natural. But I said to them also that, look, I've not come here to stop composing. And they said, we don't want you to stop composing. And offered to get me some help, because I had said at the end of 5 years I might be coming to you and saying, I want to step down and teach composition. And so at the end of 5 years, that's exactly what had happened. We had doubled our enrollment, and things were going very well there, had enlarged the campus. We were buying buildings, and so the board listened to me, and they said, look, we understand and we want to do it, but you've just, with your committee, finished the whole plan for the future of the school. And he said, we've got a big, with the state, was going to build all our buildings. And they were afraid that if I stepped down at that point, that they would say, well, we better wait. And I said, look, I'm so involved in that, I would hate to see it not go. So I said, we'll say not a word to anyone. And this was at the time when it wasn't complicated to hire people. It got more complicated afterward, but we didn't say a word, but the next summer when the legislature met, they gave us our big building money, and so at that point, I at the first convocation in my 7th year, I announced that they were going to be making a search for my... Well, I loved it at the school. It was so exciting. You know, things were happening all the time. We could have a good idea, and we could immediately try it out. If it didn't work, okay, we'd stop it. But if it worked, and one thing that was the greatest success, I think that in a way that we ever had, I had been around to a lot of universities for productions mainly of the Crucible. And I found there exactly what I had found was the case at Columbia and in a lot of other universities. The opera company didn't have any stage crews, so they had to go to the theater department. Well, in many of the cases, they didn't even speak to each other. They were so bad. So I thought, look, and we also had a design school for art. We're going to start a school for design and production. We brought in a designer and a person who was very knowledgeable from Canada backstage and started the school of design and production. To this date, every student who has graduated from that school that has stayed in the business is employed, and the reason for it, they can go backstage for any kind of production that's coming on. They had all had the experience at the school. So that's wonderful. Well, I did stay for 5 years after I stepped down. Then it happened that the big building, which is their main theater now, there was some movement of buildings around Winston-Salem, and we learned that they wanted to sell that theater. It had been a movie theater in 1929, but it was a good old building with a small hotel attached to it. So we were desperate for space in those years. So I thought about this. I'm going to look into it. So I looked into it, and I found that that building was on the market for $250,000, which was a song for a good theater and the other building. And right next to it was a 10-cent store, which was a nice big open space, and they were trying to sell that because business had gotten bad downtown. And there we were, right in the middle of town. And so I got to know Bob Scott, who was the governor, and he got interested. So I got all the state people looking at this thing, and they came up and said, it's in fine condition, you can do what you want with it, but you'll have a good sound building to start with. So we started, and I got all the figures, and I took it to the board, and that was when they said, we don't think, 2 reasons. This was also the very beginning of the hippie period, and our drama school were the first hippies in Winston-Salem. So they turned it down for the moment. But then, after I stepped down, I had a call a year or so later from the guy I'd worked with. It was owned by ABC in New York. And he called and he said, look, we've been thinking about this and we've decided we'd be willing to give the school to you. So I said, look, I'm not the person to talk to anymore. And I put him in touch with the trustees and so forth. I thought they would immediately turn it down. But the younger people who had come on to the city, they thought this was a wonderful thing. They were trying to build up the downtown again. And they thought, boy, this will be good to have a nice opera house there. So the city was going to buy it, but then they got the school operated again. So then it was given to the city. Not really, except that the period that I had in the Army changed my music because you can't help but pick up the rhythm of good jazz if you learn it and know it. And I always liked it, but suddenly I knew how to do that. The work that I wrote afterward isn't in that straight jazz sort of thing and for the orchestra of that kind, but that rhythm got into it. And the difference between my first and second symphony is mainly that suddenly there's a great drive in the second symphony, and it is a rhythmic drive, which you know that I was around jazz, but it doesn't sound like Benny Goodman. And so that was a great help. And also when I was at Tanglewood, when Hindemith was there, I had just learned a bit about, at Eastman School, Hanson wasn't in favor of the whole 12-tone thing at all, so you didn't do much there. But when I got to learning that music of that period, I liked Hindemith very much and really admired it greatly. So I studied the music. Then at that point I also studied a lot of 12-tone music to find out what I didn't like and what I liked in it. And so that period, those influences came in. After that, when I was, the two of the works are operettas. They're not operas. And that was when I, the Ohio Light Opera. Well, they did the operetta in a way that we made from Lady Kate, and they performed that, and then they did another one that I did, and then also the last one. The director there, who also had written librettos, he was a great Gilbert and Sullivan man, and so he retired from the school. He had founded it, and they wanted to do something to celebrate this. So I wrote the last of my operas was for that. Well, I tell you, I do think I'm sad that the directors have come to have, stage directors, have come to have so much power, because so many of them now want to simply turn it into their show, and some of them have been quite good, I've seen, but some are really something, I usually just go for the dress rehearsal, and I sit there thinking like that. Everything from the set. I remember one, it was at a big university. I went there, and I walked into the dress rehearsal, and some of the singers were sitting there. And just at that point, they opened up the stage, and I looked up there. They said, well, how do you like our, what did they call it? Anyhow, they had lined the whole side of the stage with pieces that looked like a sort of sled kind of that went up, and that was that. But then they had a raised stage, and under the stage they had a place where the lights would show out, and they had red lights and white lights. And the show they were doing, of course, was one which there was the evil and the good. And so the red lights would come up when evil was about, the white lights when the good folks. And also it had a big open center, and so everyone had to play around in the. It was just a disaster. Yes. Well, and I've been trying to get the one in near us that to change, because I remember I've been on the board, and I was sitting there at one meeting, and everything that was going on was, well, now, do you know this person who has money? We could probably get several thousand from them. And there was nothing about music, practically. And at the end of the meeting, I finally said, I find this rather amazing. You're all businessmen. I've had some pretty good experience in business as well. And I know about opera. I've been in a lot of opera houses. And I said, I would not think of approaching a business the way these opera companies are folding, where they're also hanging on to some rich people. And they're also, for instance, we have these wonderful musicals and some of the old operettas that are American here, that have made wonderful movies and so forth. You don't play those. You play Johann Strauss. And I said, I just don't understand it. You were here in North Carolina, where there are 4 or 5 or 6 viable opera groups. I said, I don't need to tell you how much you cut the costs of productions if you move them from one to another, and don't feel you always have to do something original, and it's your production. And I said, you could get yourself out of your economic troubles if you just began to work together with these companies. All sort of, look, what's he talking about? And so they're gradually moving this way, and there are some of them that are very, gung-ho about trying to get this sort of thing going. But I've seen it all over the country. I remember that very well because when I was in high school, I was passing the big music store in Cleveland, and they had a sale on records going out there. And they had this whole stack of the big ones, and there was the Tristan, the Prelude and Love Death from Tristan on this pile at $1 on record, and it took about 8 records. So I thought, boy, I'm going to buy that, and I bought it. Well, I took it home, and we had a fairly big Victrola, and I had never I had seen conductors, but I never thought about conducting. But I would stand in front of that recording, and I didn't know that it was in 6/8 or 8/8 or what it was, but I just was so tied up in that score. And but all those things fed into it. So by that time I was in New York, where I had a chance to see more opera than I'd ever had before. First opera I ever saw, and the first opera other than my own that I ever conducted, was Carmen, when the Met used to play 2 weeks in Cleveland. And I remember it was in a huge hall, the City Hall, and the characters were about that big from my $3.50 seat. And but so I remembered all the wonderful tunes, hit tunes in that thing. And I won't go into the story of our starting the Triangle Opera, because that all came back to that. And because they didn't know where they could do operas, and they wanted to do, the Siemens had given them a good grant to do street opera. They had heard it in Italy. And So there was no one there who could sort of decide what to try to do. And when I had just gone to Duke, and they said, look, would you have any ideas? And I said, well, give me a week to think about it. So I decided the thing to start with was cavalleria, because it all takes place out in front of the church. You don't have to have a set if you've got a church. We got a lot of those. So I drove all around Durham to see if I could find a church that would be right. Didn't find one. I was on the way home, and I passed the small trading, or place where all the shopping mall, yeah. And I thought, gee, I wonder what that's like inside. So I went in, and the middle of the place between these two big buildings would seat 600. You'd have to put the chairs in, but that was all right. You could do that. And then at one end, it had a raised place, would be fine for the stage, and enough space for the orchestra in front of it. The stage had a tree on it even, and so there were rooms there. We were working with Duke's drama program, and so they would build the sets that we needed, which were very simple, and we could get dressing rooms out of part of the building that weren't rented yet. And so I went back and I called, did you ever know Ella Fountain Pratt? Mm-hmm. Well, Ella, who was, as you know, a dynamo, I called Ella, and the person who had been a student of hers, who was head of the Arts Council in Durham at that time, and they were the ones, he was also musical, and they were interested in this whole project. And so when I got back home, I got on the phone and I called the two, because the next thought I had there, I looked up and here suddenly it was 2 tobacco warehouses. I thought, my God, what a place for Carmen. So I called them. It just took off like lightning. And we planned the opera that summer. That was the one that started it. And they said, well, you've got to conduct it. Well, I thought, well, I've never conducted any other opera. And but I thought, well, I know the hit tunes. So I said, well, okay. Well, then I got the full score, and I realized, my God, what have I got myself into? Because we were using the town's orchestra, and I knew there were some players there who just couldn't do it. And but I knew that I could also talk to them and get them to give up playing Carmen. And I knew that the rest we could manage. So we did it, and the opera company, it's the only opera company in that area that went 10 years without a deficit. Well, I tell you, when I get going on these things,